I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. My name is Sam Gurney. I'm the Regional Secretary for the TUC in London, the East and South East. My colleague Anna Kelsey from TUC Education has very nobly agreed to step into the breach because my colleague Daniel, who some of you will have been in contact with, who's been working really hard to get this webinar off the ground and organised, is unfortunately off this week due to family illness. So Anna's just going to help with helping people in. Thank you, Anna. Really glad you can all join us in this webinar on using the procurement process for supporting our outsourced workers. So we've got 4 excellent speakers who you're going to hear from shortly. There will hopefully then be a chance to ask some questions and share your experiences. When we get onto that, we haven't got this this is just set up like a normal Teams meeting. So what I'm going to ask is, if you want to come in once we've finished with the presentations, if you can just use your raise hand function, which should be at the top of your screen. I'll try and take people in groups of 3, then go back to our presenters. And if we've got time, we'll then take another round. We are definitely going to aim to finish at 4 o'clock because I know lots of people have got other meetings to get onto. The webinar is part of our Work Matters campaign, which is a joint union campaign, which is supported by the TUC. We've got an active group within our region who are working on it as well. It involves in the first instance unions who are directly at the moment representing outsourced workers. Our aim today, and this is very much we're aiming to make this the first of a series of kind of webinars for people, is to give you an overview of the procurement process and how you as trade union officers and activists can use that process to influence the outcome and improve paying conditions for outsourced workers. Our default position remains in most cases what we're trying to do is or default position of most of our unions is get people back in house. We know that's not a silver bullet on decent terms and conditions, but it often is very much a first step. So although that's the overview, I said part of this process is that we know there are, short of that, things we can do to use systems to actually get better deals for our members. We're planning the next webinar to be a 2-parter in the autumn, which will focus on campaigning for insourcing, looking at how we can use kind of all the different lessons we've learned from campaigns that have worked so far to bring stuff back in-house. But as I said, for now, we're going to be looking at the procurement process and how it can be an important step in insourcing campaigns, but also a method to win better terms and conditions in the short to medium term as well. Originally, we had this webinar planned for July the 4th. Obviously, something came along and intervened with that. We decided it wouldn't be a great idea to do it on the day of the election. It does mean that we're now having this discussion in the context of a Labour government in power nationally. There was obviously a pre-election commitment to a massive wave of insourcing. So we're waiting to see what that develops into. Obviously, we've now got the fact that there will be an employment rights bill. We'll be seeing the draft that will be being sort of discussed now. People are starting on that discussion. So this probably isn't a place to discuss all of that, but we're very much aware that we're in the context of that, and we'll look at organising a webinar, certainly when we're a bit clearer on what's in the employment rights bill and how we can use some of that to support this work as well. So with that different context we're in now with a Labour government, hopefully a more positive context. Oh, and just, on a couple of bits of etiquette for that, if everyone can mute themselves, that would be great, except for presenters who are going to be talking. I'll be muting myself shortly. We are recording this just so we've got the presentations down, and hopefully we'll find a way of sharing that with people as well. The presenters have said they'll share their presentations, those who are going to give you online presentations shortly, and any links that they're going to mention as well, and we'll make sure those go around afterwards. So don't worry about taking too many notes. You will get a copy of people's slides and any links that they want us to circulate after the meeting as well. So with that request to keep yourselves on mute if you can. So we'll come back to next steps and bits in a minute, but I will turn now without any further ado, and fingers crossed that the technology works, to Kevin Russell from Unison, who is going to give us the first presentation today. Kevin's National Officer, Bargaining Support at Unison National, and he's going to be giving us an overview of the procurement process and the pressure points that we can use in unions during that process. So Kevin, over to you.
Okay, thanks Sam. So this is the fraught moment where I try to share my screen. Can you see that there?
And that's definitely up on my screen. I'm hoping it's up on everyone else's.
All is good.
Some thumbs up. Brilliant. Okay, cheers, Kevin.
Brilliant. All right. So I've been asked to talk about the procurement process. Procurement is obviously a big area full of technical details. So it would be possible to spend 2 hours just talking about all the nuances of the regulations and bore you all to death in the process. And I might bore you to death anyway, but in the time we have, I'm just going to give a loose outline and zero in on those parts of the procurement process where unions can potentially intervene most effectively. And I'll focus on services already contracted out. So I'll be looking at how to make the case for bringing services in-house as a contract comes to a conclusion, or where it hasn't been possible to stop a contractor winning a new tender, how to win the best terms for those staff who remain contracted out. Is my screen turn? Is it shifting for you? I'm pressing the button, nothing's happening.
It hasn't moved, it's still just the title page.
Yeah.
Kevin, are you clicking forward in the PowerPoint? I think you need to control. There you go. It's changed.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay. All right. So let's just start on the regulations themselves, though. Over recent years, procurement for public authorities has been governed in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland through the Public Contract Regulations 2015, and a separate version in Scotland. But in 2023, as you're probably aware, a new Procurement Act was passed and new regulations deriving from that legislation are set to come into force in October. The devolved authorities in Scotland are not affected and the former legislation still applies there. The Labour Party, as Sam mentioned, has set out a number of further changes in its Making Work Pay document, but the procurement bill wasn't part of last week's King's Speech, so they will presumably be picked up for future parliamentary sessions. The PR for the new procurement regulations boasted that they are more flexible, and that translates into rather less prescription about what procedures have to be followed in a lot of situations. But what does potentially have some value for unions is that they place more requirements on employers to publish different forms of notice. And they demand more record keeping, and in some cases they demand more monitoring and performance over a contract. However, much of the process remains essentially unchanged, and so the challenges for unions are largely unaltered. But one of the reasons that procurement can be complex is that different rules apply to different types of contracts. So for instance, you have above and below threshold contracts. More prescriptive regulations apply to any above threshold contracts. In the case of central government, an above threshold contract is anything valued at around £140,000 or above. In the case of sub-central government, that means anything £250,000 above. And when I say sub-central, that tends to include local government, police authorities, higher education, further education, and NHS trust contracts. Then we got another set of regulations around light touch contracts, where anything above the value of £664,000 is subject to the full regulations. And light touch applies to police and probation, health, admin, education, catering, and security contracts. But a slight complication there is that when I say that, it's not the case that anyone in those particular fields, for instance, a universities in education, so any contract in their field doesn't necessarily mean it's subject to light touch. If a university is putting out to tender an IT contract, that is a contract outside of light touch regulations. So what matters is the type of contract, not the field that the organisation is working in, if that's clear. Another complication is that a lot of contracts are derived from framework and dynamic market agreements. This is where an authority establishes a group of contractors that have had to pass selection criteria to become listed as a potential supplier for a service, and then authorities can select a supplier from the listing for a specific contract. And these agreements will set out the process for selecting the supplier from the framework, which are referred to as call-off contracts. These types of contracts are often most problematic for unions because they tend to be much less prescriptive about issuing contract tender notices, where most of the opportunities arise for influencing the tendering process. And then finally on this slide, we've also got the complication of the provider selection regime. That came into force at the start of 2024 for the NHS in England, and it applies just to contracts that are about specifically on health. So again, if it's an NHS trust procuring catering, it doesn't apply. But if they're procuring some type of specific healthcare service, it would apply. So different rules, as you can see, apply to all these different types of contract in terms of what notices have to be issued publicly. And the Welsh Government has actually published a very good flowchart setting out exactly what process they have to go through in all these different scenarios, and that's one of the links I'll send around through to you after this presentation that Sam mentioned will come as part of the PowerPoint. So there are a lot of different scenarios, but the most likely one I think that you're liable to face are the requirements placed on a competitive process where a contract is due for renewal. And I've tried to set out the key the dimensions of the competitive process on this slide. Firstly, the publication of a contract tender notice will set what's called conditions of participation, in which bidders must demonstrate their legal and financial capacity to perform the contract and their technical ability to perform the contract. And I think that's what's worth noting here is that you have to be wary when they're setting out these terms, that a bar isn't set that somehow precludes or puts at a disadvantage in-house bids. One point that springs to mind, for instance, is that if a service has been outsourced a long time ago, the technical capabilities may need building up again before an in-house bid can become viable when it meets these types of conditions of participation. It's also worth noting that around this stage, there may be opportunities to exclude particularly poor employers, because the regulations do allow exclusion on a number of grounds. First of all, they offer a tender where a tender has been put forward that is priced at an abnormally low level, which can mean that they're particularly aggressively attacking terms and conditions. The bid can be ruled out simply on that basis. But bidders can be debarred under a number of other mandatory exclusion criteria, and they include labour market offences, such as offences under the National Minimum Wage Act, meaning the refusal or willful neglect to pay the national minimum wage, Gangmaster Licensing Act, Modern Slavery Act, Human Trafficking and Exploitation Act. And in Scotland, there's also the added dimension that employers can be excluded for blacklisting of trade union officials. There's also a set of discretionary exclusion criteria, and that can include an employer's record of breach of contract or poor performance in the past. But by poor performance, that's not a kind of a general concept they're getting at there. They're quite specific that means that the supplier has not performed a relevant contract to the regulated authority's satisfaction, was given the opportunity to improve and failed to do so. And then also there's the discretionary exclusion on the basis of an employer acting improperly in relation to the award of a public contract. And that means failing to provide information requested by the contracting authority or provide information that is incomplete, inaccurate or misleading. The other dimension of a contract tender that is particularly valuable for unions is that it sets out the award criteria. And that is the award criteria in terms of the weighting given to a set of established factors that the award will be based on. And this is where the opportunity lies to make labour standards a key part of the selection process. And I think it's fair to say that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have been at the forefront of establishing requirements to consider labour standards. And what I'm putting up here is an example from Scotland's Fair Work First principles, where the government has set out the expectation that the procurement process will consider all the points you can see set out there. Probably most importantly, their consideration of whether the employer pays the living wage, appropriate effective voice, which means trade union recognition, no appropriate use of 0 hours contracts, opposition to the use of fire and rehire practices. And you can see there's a variety of equality issues up there that I think Joyce and Tessa will be talking about after me. The big issue probably that isn't captured there is that it doesn't set out any expectation about pay rises being linked to national awards. So typically NJC or SJC awards in local government or Agenda for Change in the NHS. And it may also be possible to go beyond what's set out there under Fair Work First, so that these types of conditions don't just apply to transferred staff, but they also apply to new starters, and therefore block off the possibility
we won't pay any attention to.
Possibility of the emergence of a two-tier workforce. The regulations do provide some devices, it should be said also, for avoiding a competitive process and allow an in-house solution. First of all, the regulations set out possible circumstances where direct awards can be made. And you can see there one of the options is where only one supplier is possible. There's a situation where there's extreme urgency. And there's also a situation where procurement can switch to a direct award where an authority embarks on a competitive process, but there's no suitable tenders have been received. And the other dimension of regulations I should mention is also exempted contracts. So these are contracts that stand outside of the regulations. And the most typical ones are vertical arrangements, and what they mean by that is usually where a public authority sets up a wholly owned subsidiary, and there's horizontal arrangements, which is usually where 2 or more public authorities operate a joint service together. So in those specific circumstances, contracts can be awarded directly. And obviously, we only want to use this dimension in the regulations where the direct award is going to an in-house provider. But in general, in-house solutions tend to come from trying to persuade the employer to simply allow a contract to terminate and let those services return to in-house provision, as no legal requirement sits on an authority to put a service out to tender again once a contract ends. And for all the rational arguments of persuasion that we're setting out here, our experience of successful campaigns suggests that unions are only liable to shift to employers to in-house solutions where employers can see the strength of feeling inside and outside the organisation and the difficulties they're liable to face in sticking with privatisation. So in advance of the procurement process beginning for a new contract and in parallel with that process taking place, most successful campaigns to bring services in-house at conclusion of the contract cover these 3 steps. So gathering information on the contracts, building union strength in the contractor and mobilising the workforce behind the campaign, and then going beyond the workforce and winning allies who can exert pressure on decision makers. And I'll just finish by saying a little bit about these topics in turn. One of the most critical pieces of information in planning any campaign is plainly the contract end date, particularly as the Association for Public Service Excellence estimates that you need 2 years to develop and implement an effective campaign. You may have that information to hand, but where you're seeking that information from a contract details notice, that has to be issued for most contracts when awarded. You should look at these main sources. First of all, find a tender which carries the information on high value contracts. Secondly, contract finder, or the equivalents in devolved nations, which carries the information for lower value contracts. For any contract that was agreed prior to Britain's exit from the European Union, you can find it on the official journal of the European Union. And then for areas like local authorities, they will often have their own contract register sitting on their own organisational website. But if all of those fail, then you probably will have to turn to a direct request to the employer. That normally relies on the ACAS Code of Practice on disclosure of bargaining information. And if that fails, people often turn to a freedom of information request to try to extract that type of information. But I'll send around the link for all those sources that I've set out there. So when it comes to building union strength in the contractor and mobilising staff behind the campaign, we encourage the use of this template for thinking about the key task in that process. So across the top, you've got the makeup of the workforce in terms of activists, members, non-members, and along the side, you've got all the activities targeting those groups down the left. And to pick out 2 of those areas where I think case studies repeatedly show their importance for successful campaigns. One of the important dimensions of gathering views is that the experience and knowledge of contractor staff is often invaluable in building a credible in-house proposal. And one of the most important dimensions of the union providing information to staff is that successful campaigns often help staff understand in a clear way the consequences of moving in-house to their terms and conditions and galvanise the kind of anger that worries employers. For planning how to bring on board key allies to the campaign, this template is intended to assist in thinking through who your potential allies are and how you're going to target them. So the most common broad groups are shown down the left. So that's service users, community groups, media, councillors, MPs, bodies like overview and scrutiny committees, and the senior management of the public authority itself. And finally, although this is a rather wordy slide, this is a template for thinking through the messages and the evidence you can assemble to support the case that you put to staff and to your allies, to bring on board staff and allies in a campaign. Oh, disappeared. Have you just lost that?
Yeah,
have you lost that on your
that
screen?
Just came off, Kevin, but we will.
Yeah.
Just gone back. We've also just hit time on that presentation, but we'll circulate those around those messages. I'm just looking at the printout I did because I saw them. They're really excellent. That's just making me think. So, Kevin, sorry, is that okay
yeah,
for now?
Do you want me to stop, try and reshare just that last page?
Do you want to just put that last slide up again? So we will send them around to everyone. If you can get back to that last slide of messages.
Yeah.
Well, it's gone then. I think just because of time, I said if we assure people they'll be coming round. I would like to move on. Yep. So we've got the presentation back, but it's not.
Would you rather move on, Sam?
Kevin, is that all right? If we just move on, I said we'll get those round to everyone. But I said people did see those. Thank you, because there was so much there, and I said those last grids are just really, I find because I find grids really useful. But and I said that messaging I think is just really handy. So thank you ever so much for that. But we'll come back to points and questions for Kevin in a minute. I'm delighted that next we've got Professor Tessa Wright and Dr. Joyce Mamodi from Queen Mary's University. And we're buying social justice through procurement project, who are, as Kevin said, going to touch on a number of aspects of this work and that's useful for us, but particularly looking at how we can support our equality work as well, whilst running these campaigns and using the procurement process to support that angle of our work. Joyce or Tessa, I'm not sure who's going first. You did tell me and I've just forgotten, so I'll hand over to you and you can decide.
Okay, so I'm going to lead presentation and Tessa's going to cover any questions, and she's hopefully going to work the slides for me. Are you okay with that, Tessa?
Can you see them all right?
Yes, they are fine.
Excellent, good.
Okay, so as it was mentioned, we're going to be looking at the kind of equality and diversity aspects that can be used to influence the procurement process. So if we just go to the first main slide. So what we're going to talk about is based on a research project that was led by Tessa and I was part of, together with Hazel Connolly and Katerina Sartov, who were from University of the West of England and Warwick University. The project also involved an advisory board on which were a number of senior trade unionists. So that's perhaps why we ended up with such a strong steer on the important role that unions can play in helping to encourage equality and diversity to be considered through the procurement process. So what we were actually looking at in the project was how public bodies across England, Scotland and Wales might be using their procurement processes to promote social justice aspects that would be of interest to them, including, with a particular focus on equality issues. But as we went through it, we did identify particularly some really important opportunities that trade unions have got to get involved in influencing procurement in this, not only to talk about employment standards, also using arguments related to equality and diversity in order to help promote these issues across the board and to get that influence into the process. Now, the project itself was particularly focused on the construction industry, and it's interesting because it's a bit of a different angle on the question of outsourcing and insourcing, because for most public bodies, construction is necessarily an outsourced activity. So with the exception perhaps of the direct labour organisations in local authorities and perhaps in some housing associations, construction projects tend to be quite large and necessitate being contracted out anyway. So initially what we were looking at was not the insourcing outsourcing question, but how procurement more generally can be used to promote social justice objectives. And it's interesting as well to look at construction because it is very hard to organise sector. It's got issues, as someone mentioned blacklisting earlier. It's got a history of blacklisting of trade unionists. There's a big section of the sector where there's quite an anti-union attitude. There's health and safety, lots of issues in construction, but there are also equality and diversity issues. Women are a small proportion of the skilled trades in construction. Ethnic minorities are poorly represented in construction, yet it can often be a form of employment, despite all the anti-union culture in parts of it. Where it is well organised, it can create some quite decently well-paid work, particularly for women, that contrasts with other types of job that maybe they would end up being much less well paid for. So there are reasons why we want to encourage both strong union activity, good employment standards, and a focus on equality and diversity in construction. So let's just look a bit more at what we found then. So we're looking at quite a hard to organise sector. So what we did was we talked to experts working in procurement, experts working in equality, diversity and inclusion across England, Scotland and Wales. And we also talked to quite senior trade union officials in England, Scotland and Wales about what they saw as the key barriers and enablers to including quality issues in procurement. We did a survey of procurement officers, and I think most interestingly for this webinar, we did some in-depth case studies of good practice where equality and social justice objectives were being included in the procurement activities of public bodies, particularly in relation to construction. Finally, in the project, it was very much a project focused on practical outcomes. So as well as the toolkit, which I'll talk about in a minute, we presented our initial findings to workshops of specialists and including some trade unionists to get together and talk about how we could improve the use of procurement for these social justice purposes. So we're kind of approaching it from a different angle, looking at how people can be working a bit closer together where the objectives are similar in terms of trying to promote good practice through the way procurements are being set up. So we go to the next slide. One of the key outputs of the project was an equality and diversity toolkit, and that's really what we want to focus this presentation mainly on, and what we think will be quite useful to the people on this call. Because what the toolkit does is, building on what Kevin was talking about previously, it looks at the process of procurement rather than the legislation as such. It talks about the process in an organisation and looks at each stage, what are the ways that equality and social justice objectives can be built into what's actually taking place. Now, the toolkit was particularly aimed at procurement and equality specialists, but it can also be used by trade unions, primarily to promote equality and diversity through procurement. Also, we have included the consideration of other employment standards, such as gender and ethnicity pay gaps, which I think were mentioned by Kevin before. We're creating opportunities for apprenticeships and employment opportunities for underrepresented groups, but also linking to that some of those basic standards such as the living wage and encouragement for trade union representation and giving people voice channels in order to be able to talk about things that maybe not be going so right in the delivery of a contract. So the toolkit highlights 6 key principles that we identify for best practice in procurement, 2 of which are particularly relevant to trade unions and how they can gain leverage in the procurement process. The first of these is strategic alignment, and the second is collaboration and partnership working. I'll just say a little bit about each. So strategic alignment is about thinking about what an organisation, so a public authority or whoever the employers are, what do they say at a strategic level? What are their objectives? They will often have equality strategies, business plans, kind of high level talk of their objectives about promoting equality, promoting good employment standards, ethical employment, all those kinds of things. And what can be done, the arguments can be harnessed in the sense of creating a link between those high level strategic objectives and what they're actually putting into their procurement processes and their actual requirements in procurement. Don't assume that people are necessarily themselves drawing these links within the kind of professional aspects of the procurement process and the procurement specialists. One of the things we found in the project was people who are working on procurement are extremely busy and they don't necessarily have the time to do all this kind of high level strategic thinking about how these things link into other objectives in the organisation. They may be focused on that very detailed technical aspects of getting their procurement legally correct. So there is a lot of leverage and a lot of mileage in trade unions trying to highlight through other avenues, for example, consultation forums, where these links can be drawn to strategic policies within a particularly public authorities, which tend to have these kinds of policies. Collaboration and partnership working. That's, you often think of that in terms of working within the employer themselves, but we're also talking here about how unions can link into use service user groups, civil society organisations who themselves will have an input and a view as to the quality and the kinds of services and requirements they want to see in a procurement as well. So when we talk about collaboration and partnership working, we're talking in that much broader sense, as well as trying to work within the organisation itself, looking for people you can influence who aren't necessarily part of that procurement process directly, but who may have an input and may help build your case for why standards need to be set that are of a higher nature, both in terms of equality, but also in terms of employment standards more generally. And I think it's probably fair to say that if you're approaching these kinds of arguments from that equality and diversity perspective, sometimes you can get more buy-in because maybe it's seen as a less confrontational way of approaching the argument than going directly for the insourcing, outsourcing. But as you'll see, as I progress through this, they are linked. They can be linked to one another, because looking at these kinds of issues can lead you to start thinking about whether insourcing is a better option than trying to deal with employers who may not be as good in terms of the outsourced contractors. Okay, so if we turn to the next slide, in terms of the levers that enable us to make arguments around equality in procurement, we've got the public sector equality duty, and it's likely, well, we'll see what happens with the Labour government, but it's likely that some of these things are going to become more in the forefront of public employers' minds as we go through and we get more used to the new administration than maybe they have been in the last few years. But the duty on public sector employers is that they need to demonstrate due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimisation. They need to demonstrate advancing equality of opportunity and fostering good relations. They also need to often demonstrate these things in their policy agendas and their own business strategies. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So just thinking about those things in more detail and becoming accustomed and aware of those, what employers are saying about these things, are really, really important levers. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Moving to the next slide. Equality impact assessments. As with any activity of a public authority, there is a point at which, at the start of a procurement process, they will go through an equality impact assessment. And there's an opportunity there for trade unions to try and influence the inclusion of equality objectives in that process, and to get those then as requirements within the procurement. And then that can actually create an argument for you to be involved in the monitoring of that contract and what happens during it. Because if you decide that in a contract you want to promote women's employment, for example, then you might want to be also saying, well, we need a trade union presence and access to those workers so that there is an opportunity for people to raise issues. And also to be able to feed that in at the end of a contract, to be able to highlight where issues were arising. Okay, so moving to the next slide. I will speed up dramatically now because we've not got long. Lots of what I've talked about here is all set out in our equality and diversity toolkit. There is a QR code to it there, but as Sam said, the link will be circulated after the meeting, and it includes some really useful case studies, including one of a housing association that brought its renovation team, contracting team in-house as a result of the monitoring of quality types of issues. And finally, the toolkit is, it's got lots in it, some of which was for procurement specialists. So we have also produced a trade union guide to the toolkit, which has a very handy checklist that gives kind of really handy list of all the key things to think about in terms of using this whole process to get in and thinking about recruiting amongst the contracted workforce, about monitoring workers' experiences, about using political influence, a lot of the things that Kevin talked about earlier. I'll leave it there because what we'd like you to do is download our toolkit and download the trade union guidance and have a look and hopefully be able to use it to your advantage in the future. And if you need to contact us or ask us further questions outside of this, our emails are there. So I'll leave it there, Sam.
Joyce, thank you. And that was a minute under time. So, but as you said, that's really good that your contact details are on there, because I think, again, this shows that kind of that mix of the ways we can use this. But again, that process on timings and information. So I would really recommend people downloading and having a look at that guide and some of this work that's out there. And we will circulate that. I'm going to come back to the end about how we're going to set something up as well to help share information. But without further ado, I'm going to turn to Tabsam Ahmed, who is regional organiser at Unite in London and Eastern region. Tabsam, last but by no means least, Tabsam's been involved in a whole load of very practical campaigns on supporting insourced workers, supporting insourcing and supporting outsourced workers. So over to you, Tabsam, and then we'll have some time to open it up afterwards.
Thank you, Sam, and it would have been really helpful to have heard Kevin and Josh's presentation before I delved into these campaigns. I'm going to talk about two specific ones. One is the Bexley refuse workers and the other one is Barts, who were employed by Serco. So Bexley, first of all, these were refuse workers employed by Serco. They had had enough of bullying and victimisation, and also pay disparity and a number of other issues in terms of sick pay. We were also aware that their contract was about to come up for renewal. Now, we tried so many times to engage the local authority. They ignored us. They wouldn't talk to us. They said the process was confidential. You know, I didn't have a clue whether it was or not, but I still insisted on trying to get their attention. They refused to engage. We embarked on a industrial ballot, which we got over the line, and started to commence industrial action, trying to resolve the issues in dispute. Serco were not speaking to us. And during our members being on strike, we heard the outcome of the tendering process, and Serco were not given the renewal contract. It was given to Country Style. So what that told us, right, our campaigning before that tendering process of saying that Serco had a number of issues. They were not treating their employees equally. Their terms and conditions were awful. They were, you know, it was a race to the bottom of terms and conditions, and that needed to be addressed by the local authority, and ultimately it's the local authority's responsibility. So although they didn't engage with us, we were pleased on one hand that Serco didn't get the contract, but on the other hand, we were disappointed that they didn't take them in-house. So, and we were given the reasons such as it's complicated, it's very hard to take contracts back in-house, and this is the best we could have done. Now, we were out on strike action and there were huge issues. Now, Country Style were coming in. We made it very clear to Country Style that if you didn't sit down and negotiate and talk to us about pay terms and conditions, this dispute will continue. Now, members continue to take strike action. For 7 weeks, they were on that picket line, during which we were negotiating with Country Style. And I'm pleased to say, although it was a long road of industrial action, Country Style did negotiate with us, and we managed to get pay parity, better terms and conditions, and also a better sickness policy in terms of industrial injury. Because prior to this negotiation, our members didn't get any extra industrial sick pay. So what this meant for our workers on the ground, a number of them saw a 30 to 40% pay increase, which was amazing, absolutely phenomenal, considering what we had been fighting for ages, for years. Now, that was my first-hand experience on trying to get a contract back in-house. As I said, it was a bit disappointing it wasn't taken back in-house, but I went straight from the picket lines of Serco Bexley to Serco in Barts Health NHS Trust. Now, as you can imagine, they were very pleased to know that I was now moving into Barts and, you know, continuing a campaign there, or not maybe. But these group of workers, there were 1,800 workers who were predominantly Black migrant women doing roles like ward hosts, domestics, porters, security, back of house catering. Now, just before the summer of 2021, we had back of house catering come out on strike because of bullion managers. And initially Serco wouldn't engage, but in the end they did capitulate and gave us what we wanted. Now that was that small campaign of about 15 to 20 workers actually galvanized and empowered the rest of the workforce. But it was challenging because members didn't believe that they could make change happen. Now we went to Barts and asked them again and again to consider taking this group of workers back in-house. We were aware there was a break clause on the 30th of November, and we asked Barts to exercise that break clause and give notice to Serco. They refused to do so. We said this campaign, this dispute was not going to go anywhere. We will continue fighting. We had a lot of work to do ourselves on the ground in terms of organising, speaking to members. On the 1st of November 2021, we gave notice to Serco for an industrial action ballot. And to our surprise, but also we were elated, that Serco gave notice to Barts Trust on the 3rd of November that they were going to exercise the break clause. Now, that's never been heard of before. And we do believe because of the campaigning we had been doing 6 months ahead of this, it paid off because they realized that we were not going to go away and our membership was getting stronger and stronger and started to fight back. And that was a turning point for us in terms of our campaign. It gave hope to our members. Actually, we can make change happen. However, Barts still refused to consider taking members back in-house. They said it was a long and complicated process. We were asking for this group of workers to be taken back in-house and put an agenda for change from day one. They said it was impossible. They gave examples like Great Ormond Street, which had been 2 years since a group of workers had been taken back in-house and was still not being put on agenda for change. I didn't believe them. I advised my members and reps accordingly. I said, where there's a will, there's a way. We need to continue campaigning. Our ballot closed on the 8th of December. We had a fantastic result. And at that point, Barts then did start to engage and said they will consider options, and one of them may be in-house. But again, they would not give any commitment. They did meet with us and other unions to try and discuss, but there was no commitment. We felt that we had no option but to take strike action because we had about 10 issues in dispute here. Now, we had made it very clear to Barts that the one thing that will resolve this dispute is you making the decision, taking it back in-house. They said that's not right because it's not on your ballot paper. I said, are you going to give us everything on our ballot paper? If you give us that, we'll resolve this dispute. But they knew they couldn't give us everything in that ballot, which was pay award in line with agenda for change. It was, trying to address the bullying and harassment. There were a number of issues alongside those. So they knew we were here for the long run. Our members took 2 weeks strike action in February, and then we gave further notice. We had a break of about 3 weeks. We gave further notice for another 2 weeks of strike action to commence. Now, in the middle of this, I need to highlight the work that went on outside of the members' campaigning. We spoke to many local community groups, Unite Community, politicians, to try and get them engaged in this campaign, and also members of the public who use the facilities of the hospital. We held an exhibition of quotes from our members, what they felt, how they were treated working under Serco. Now, this really was an eye-opener, not just for members of the public, but also for our other members in Barts Trust who worked alongside these workers, had no idea they were employed by Serco. They just thought they were employed by the NHS and had no idea how they were being treated. And it actually brought that whole membership together because they started standing united and started making their views heard as well. And that was an immense amount of work. We also had an MP who was vocal about it in Parliament as well, that we needed to end privatisation, and any NHS groups that were also campaigning about ending privatisation in the NHS. So this was a joint effort. And I don't think it would have been as effective if it wasn't a joint effort as it was. I felt like it was a big wave of people who actually helped this happen. When we gave notice for the last bit of 2 weeks of strike action, I say last bit because I'm sure you can imagine what happened next. they still held back. They still said, we can't guarantee them going back in-house. We're still considering our options. But the Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. before strike action was to commence on the Monday, they came through with an agreement that they will take this group of workers back in-house, pending a decision from the board on the following Tuesday, but they would be making that recommendation. On that basis, we did suspend strike action. But in addition to that, we also got agreement that they will place all workers on AFC terms and conditions from day one of being transferred in. That was a fantastic result, phenomenal result. No one thought we could get it. I've got to say, my colleagues across the board, people who had worked in the NHS for ages, really felt this could not happen because it was too much of a large group. There were 1,800 workers here. But I think also Barts didn't count on these predominantly migrant women workers making a stand, because and we did also raise the equality issue throughout that dispute, which I forgot to mention. We said these were predominantly black workers, and you not bringing them in-house is discriminatory. You're doing this because they are predominantly black and women workers. So all of that paid off. But in addition to that, the other group of workers who were employed by Serco, who was subcontractor, were Synergy. Synergy were the linen workers. Bart said we could not bring them back in-house because they didn't have the facilities. We campaigned really hard. We made it very clear that if you did not put them on AFC terms and conditions again from day one, which was the 1st of May 2023, this dispute will continue in a different form, and it will come back stronger than you've ever seen before. Now, even though they were a small group, Barts were a bit wary, not sure where we would go with this. And when we came to the tendering process of who those people were, they wouldn't tell us. They said it was confidential. Now, bearing in mind, I had no experience of the tendering process, procurement. I just carried on asking questions. And in the end, again, I'm delighted to say that they made the decision to give the contract on the basis of AFC pay terms and conditions from day one, which is fantastic. So some key things to put across. Never think a question is a silly question. Ask how many questions you want, because if you don't, you won't get an answer. And I have no shame when it comes to asking questions. That's how I've managed to achieve with my reps what we have. Organize, build, and have those face-to-face conversations, and believe in what you're actually campaigning for, because if you don't believe, then your members won't believe. And that is really important, because that's what we managed to turn around. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I have singularly not, because I did not want to stop any of the presenters there because you were all giving us so much brilliant information. So I have singularly failed to chair this in time to give us much time for questions, but I'm very conscious that we've got some really excellent people on the attendance list. I know we've got colleagues there from PCS, GMB, RMT that we're working with on this campaign, on the Our Work Matters campaign in the region. So with the indulgence of the presenters, if you can just stay on the line a little bit past 4 o'clock, I'd like to just take one round, if I can, of points and questions, because I think you gave us so much to think about there, all 4 of you. But if we can, I'd really like to just take one round, and then we'll let you go. But so this is very much the first of these seminars. So anyone who wants to jump in, if I could ask you to actually make a quick point or ask a question, do raise your electronic hands now. Can take these in order. So I've got George Sharkey first. George, if you could just wait and see if there's anyone else. I'm going to have a little quick look in there's a Q&A box which just appeared. We'll see if anyone's typed anything there. My one is not coming up with that. I've got George, and then I've got Trevor. And then I'm going to take the point that Anne's just put into the chat in the question bit. George, do you want to go first? And then Trevor, if you're ready to come in afterwards.
Yeah, just regarding when you're outsourcing, the actual recognition agreement with the recognised unions, it's how the organisation that the 2P in actually can can see what that recognition agreement is, it needs to be quite clear when we go across, because just recently I'm having a 2p transfer where basically they never told me, it needs to be up to the members to inform me. So I think it's clear that we need to get the recognition agreement for all recognised trade unions to be fundamental when it comes to transferring, whether in or out. It needs to be clear that we should be consulted on any changes, even if that company is going to transfer them again to a third party. We need to be clear that that's what recognition is, terms and conditions, and all the requirements. Because what we're seeing is job descriptions changing, where the company actually turns around and says, "Oh, we'll give you a better pay rise than what you're getting now and whatnot, but just sign this contract." That's where we need to really knuckle down regarding recognition.
George, thanks. I'm going to take Trevor. I mean, I'm going to read out a question that Anne has asked, has put into the chat. So, Trevor.
My part in following on, because I think in all of these processes, the important thing is to maintain strong, resilient collective bargaining rights, which hinge on good employment collective bargaining relationships. And I think in delivery standards, monetary contact, preserving equality and diversity, nobody's mentioned about the fact there is probably a need, in many cases, to produce a new collective recognition agreement, which enshrines everything you've been talking about, including the collective bargaining rights that exist prior to any transfer of employment to the new employer.
Thanks, Trevor. And I'm going to cheat because I'm going to read out Anne's one, and then I'm going to come to Kelly, that'd be lovely, and we'll hear from Kelly, and then we'll go back to the presenters, and then we'll wrap up. So Anne in the chat has just put in, the sort of thing has been said before, but equality's never been able to be a key determining factor in awarding of contracts. It always comes down to essentials of service delivery and cost usually. Could you give us an example? I suspect this is to Tessa and Joyce in particular, given the research you've done of where it's worked and where equality angles have actually been able to be a determining factor in either opposing and outsourcing or in improving things in procurement. And Kelly, lovely to see you. Do you want to come in?
Yes, hello.
Long time no see, mate.
Yes, indeed.
Since
Cheltenham, anyway. Yeah, thank you to the speakers. Really, really interesting, and congratulations to our Unite colleague over at Bart's magnificent campaign. I know Unison were involved in that as well. Just some of the stuff that's coming across us here at Unison for our insourcing campaigns is just to the sheer panoply of different terms and conditions people are on. Some of the feedback that we are getting from members when we're running insourcing campaigns, because obviously we run a two-pronged campaign, parity on terms and conditions, whether, as Kevin made mention, an uplift to the NJC if we can, or agenda for change, applying agenda for change awards with the lump sum in last year's agreement to our private contractor members. So trying to get parity first if we can't get insourcing around the procurement process or when there's a retender process. But some of the information that we get fed back from members around concerns that may need some more work being done for is some of the anxieties about actually going back into public services. Now, whilst I and many trade unionists around this forum today can sit here and announce the virtues of that, if you've had people that have worked in, say, Serco, or where it's a multi-conglomerate, or ISS, or Sodexo, there's sometimes a perception that there's opportunity for promotion within that, outside of the NHS or outside of the usual local government structures. So sometimes we do have it fed back that there are concerns around that, but the bigger issue is what protections they have going forward if, because of the public sector pay freezes, we have instances where people are actually paid more. Yes, other terms and conditions may be preferential, but there's a lot of concern about going back in-house. And I mean, at Bart's there was a big issue around for those that went back around applying the lump sum out of last year's Agenda for Pay, Agenda for Change Pay Award for those that went back in because of the timing of it. So I just think we need to keep one eye on what our members are actually telling us as well, and be responsive to that and listen to that, and really do a lot more work around, you know, how we not just encourage employers but also work with our members as well, around those anxieties which are very, very real. So but brilliant work on that campaign as well, so must add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So I'm going to come back to our presenters now, and if you can answer the points made or specific points there, and then anything else you want to say in your wrap up, that would be great. I'm going to go in reverse order, partly because it's logical, because as you said, Kelly, Tabasam and the members at Bart's exactly dealt with some of this. It's not a silver bullet in terms of insourcing questions. So Tabasam, can I come to you first, and then I'll come back to Tessa and Joyce, and then we'll finish with Kevin.
Kelly, you're absolutely right. We need to be speaking to the members, and that's how we managed to do what we did. In terms of what the members were saying and what management saying, there was a difference, and you sometimes thinking, well, hang on a minute, our members can't be just hearing this, there must be, you know, something happening. So yes, we do need to talk, but also I think it's really important, and I'm only mentioning this because you mentioned this, that I really do think time has come, and it should always have been there, that unions need to unite in every campaign we have in a workplace as well. And I know the TUC are trying to encourage that, because that is really key in trying to resolve a lot of our issues quicker than we are. So there's a lot of joint up working happening on the ground, and I'm trying to encourage that. But the employer and the government, I'm going to say, in terms of NHS Health, relies on the disconnect of our members with officials like us or even the trade unions, and they try and play that to their advantage. So we have a hell of a lot of work, not just as individual trade unionists, but in terms of us as you know, with our sister unions. But the members are key here, absolutely. They have the most information you can think of. I just want to highlight that we're renegotiating the recognition agreement in Barts currently, and one of the points all of us unions collectively have asked for, and that's a number of us, is that any subcontractor, any service that is contracted out must also adhere to the Barts recognition agreement with trade unions, and ensure Bart should ensure that pay terms and conditions are in line with AFC. Now, you know, there's obviously a debate going on. We're going to wait for a response for them. But I think somebody did ask about the recognition agreement, or highlighted that, and you're absolutely right. In terms of, just quickly, I know this might not have been touted at me, the equality, we did use the equality factor for Bart's Trust. We banged on about that. We actually also put in a freedom of information request on an equality audit of those workers, which they never responded to, by the way, but obviously they were concerned about how that would escalate further. In every comms and every conversation we were having, we highlighted the equality. So it does work, and Joyce's presentation was brilliant, by the way, and something that we can use moving forward, because we do forget that when we are campaigning on the ground.
To unmute. Sorry, thank you, Sam, very much. Tessa and Joyce.
So just on Anne's question about equality being the determining factor in the contract, I'm not sure it would be a determining factor, but it can be a factor. So you can specify, I mean, for example, I remember you have a look in the toolkit for the case studies, but HS2 is one of them, and they were saying it's, you know, the margins can be quite sort of minimal in terms of all the different factors that come together in assessing the tenders, and you know, equality can be one where if you got an edge on that, they're more likely to get it. You know, some things are required, like in some contracts, living wage or trade union recognition could be one. But I think it's often about kind of unions getting involved at the early stages to sort of get those equality considerations included. Joyce, did you want to add anything on that one?
No, I think you've covered it all there. Thanks, Tessa.
Yeah, but have a look at examples. I mean, TfL, Transport for London, is a good one in the case study, in the toolkit.
Great, thanks both. And then finally, and before I do a tiny bit of a wrap up, Kevin.
I think everything's been said really, Sam. So yeah, particularly with this over, yeah, there's nothing I want to add to that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting us go slightly over time. We will, as I said, send out the slides and the other links. We're going to try and set up a WhatsApp broadcast group so we can actually send stuff out, extra stuff that we get out to people who've been on the call. So we'll do that. We'll send a link to that when we send out the other information. And just to really encourage people to, if you're not signed up to the TUC regional bulletin, if you're in our region, that's where we put lots of information about the current actions which are going on. So at the moment, obviously, we've got the GMB PCS dispute with G4S guards at the DWP. We've got range of other PCS disputes, range of other disputes kind of coming up. So really encouraging people across unions to get down to support each other's picket lines there and stuff. So lots of information there around actions which are ongoing. So please do sign up to that bulletin, because we'll always put the latest stuff there which is going on around outsourced workers in the region. We will get dates out for the next couple of these seminars, which will be now after Congress. We're going to give it, well, obviously people are away over August, and we'll wait till we're TUC Congress is passed. So we'll be looking at dates in October and November for the next set of webinars, and I really hope you'll be able to join us for those. We'll be looking at some very practical stuff on campaigning. Thank you again to the speakers, and thank you all for taking part in it this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.